This is ESG Decoded, the podcast powered by ClimeCo to provide relevant, actionable updates related to business innovation and sustainability. Join Kaitlyn Allen and Amanda Shea of ClimeCo for thoughtful, nuanced conversations with industry leaders that explore the complexities, the risks, and the opportunities connected to all things ESG. I'm Yvonne Harris, a consultant and a co-host, and I will be collaborating with Kaitlyn and Amanda for the discussions that we will present on this podcast. Put simply, ESG is everything that's not on your balance sheet. This leaves room for misunderstanding, oversimplification, and the tendency towards one-size-fits-all perspectives. None of that will happen on this podcast. Enjoy this episode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today we are really excited to have a governance-focused episode. So we often talk about the E in ESG, the S in ESG. Rarely do we do an episode dedicated to the G in ESG. In order to excel in today's competitive business environment, a successful E, S, and G leader does need a balance of compliance, sustainability, and project management skills, backed by robust policy design expertise. That's why I've invited Dr. Monique Cunningham to join us today. She is the rare professional with experience across the E, S, and G of ESG, with over 15 years experience leading strategic ESG projects for multiple high-profile organizations, including St. Thomas University and the City of Tallahassee. In addition to her vast professional experience as a risk management and compliance professional, Dr. Cunningham holds a doctorate in law and policy from Northeastern, an MBA from Nova Southeastern University, and a bachelor's in biology from Barry University. Dr. Cunningham, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Kaitlyn. Thank you for having me today.
I'm so grateful to have you on. I know that this has been a long time coming. We've been trying to plan this one, and I'm so grateful to finally have you. Monique, Dr. Cunningham, is joining us from Fort Lauderdale. Is it sunny there today?
It actually is. We had an, quote unquote, cold front, which only removed the humidity and allowed it to be breezy. So it's one of those Chamber of Commerce days today where it's beautiful sunshine, good breeze, and, what everyone would consider down here as a beach day.
Awesome. Well, I hope you get to hit it later. Maybe not. I know you're very busy. I wanted to start today with a fun question for you. So you're a doctor. You are hold a doctorate in law and policy, and not very many people have PhDs, mainly because of the dissertation, from what I hear. And I know that it's something that you spent many years of your life on. And so I always like to ask folks that do have PhDs what their dissertation was. So, and yours is very related to the topics at hand. So I was wondering if you could start by sharing a little bit about your dissertation.
So yes, it was a fun experience deciding to go back to school to obtain my doctorate. My dissertation actually focused on Florida and the Clean Power Plan. And even though I knew the Clean Power Plan wasn't going to go anywhere in the stage that it was in, I wanted to better understand the policy ramifications behind that proposed regulation coming from the EPA, and understand exactly what the negative aspects were of it, as well as any of the positive aspects of it, and see really how it was going to impact states like Florida, and then create a baseline of, okay, if this is how we can structure it for Florida, how can this be modified to other states like, Massachusetts or South Carolina, North Carolina, or other, just states, or even Montana? How can we modify and do a scenario-based analysis of, reducing emissions that are particular for the makeup of the state based on their energy profile? So what I did is, using my MBA background in economics, I decided to focus on the environmental economics using that as the baseline for my study, and then, understanding the legal aspects of the Clean Power Plan, and then making a policy recommendation at the end. And I decided to approach it as any other risk that we want to mitigate. We voluntarily purchase, or maybe not always voluntarily, but we purchase health insurance, auto insurance, homeowners insurance, but we do not, whenever we think of climate, it's with this negative connotation of, well, there's going to be a climate tax and we're going to be taxed. Well, I looked at it as, why won't we provide an insurance policy for what we are all experiencing? And in the dissertation, I wrote about how the Department of Defense did a study that said climate is one of the biggest things that will cause disturbance around the world, and cause different communities to have to flee and look for resources that allow them to be able to survive and support their families. And so, using that as a jumping off point, I wrote about Bangladesh. And, we always think about, well, this is something that impacts communities outside of the US. And they said, yes, this is something that does impact communities outside of the US, but let's look at what's impacting here at home. And so I wrote about the Isle de Jean Charles, which is a island south of Louisiana, and explain how this community is one of the first U.S. climate refugees, and how the Department of Housing and Urban Development has awarded the community $48 million to relocate to another part of the U.S. because the Army Corps of Engineers has decided that their island is not salvageable due to years of dredging and just the rising seas. Then,
Wow.
bringing it closer to home, what's happening here in South Florida. I grew up here in South Florida, and I remember as a child, I never had to worry about or even thought about flooding and sea level rise. That was something that was in the far future. And here as an adult, and being a chemist when I first started, and driving around to areas throughout Broward County, county in South Florida, and collecting water samples, it became more and more of a talking point, because we were seeing issues with where salt water was going into freshwater areas, and causing that to change chemically, right? And trying to figure out, okay, what can we do here in South Florida to mitigate against this risk? Well, we have now what are king tide floods, and we've always had them, but now you have a day today where we have a Chamber of Commerce day, and it's beautiful and sunny. And, when it's later on in the year, in September and October, you will be walking, and if it's in the middle of a king tide flood moment, you're walking through certain streets in downtown, and you're like, why is the water above my ankle? What is going on here?
Wow.
And
Is that called sunny day floods? I've also heard it called.
yes, sunny day floods.
The sunny day flooding, yeah.
We've had no rain for days, and all of a sudden the streets are flooded because the water has now come in through storm drains. And Florida, or makeup, is of a stone that think of it as Swiss cheese, has lots of holes in it. And so it's great for water filtration and where we get our drinking water. It goes into the aquifer, it filters down, and we have wonderful drinking water. But when it goes in the opposite direction, water now goes back up through that Swiss cheese and is now in the streets. And so we're now having to spend money, billions and billions of dollars every year, to mitigate against that risk. And what can we do? Why not put it in an insurance fund, so that way communities are paying, a nominal cost to a fund to be able to pull out of that fund and pay for climate resiliency projects. It's things that we're doing anyways, but we're always doing it as an emergency. And why not do it with more planning and foresight, so that way we can really address what's happening now? It's not something that's in the future, like when we were kids. It's happening now.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And in your dissertation, I'm kind of sitting here chuckling to myself because I was like, this is an episode about governance, but this is governance, right? This is how do we manage these risks? And with your policy background, it's there's such a rich discussion there. So I promise that we will get to governance in a minute, but I just to wrap this part of the conversation up, Monique. So what was your recommendation in your dissertation, and is anyone doing it yet?
So there's some communities here and there that are addressing it in varying ways, going after the pollutant themselves. So going after electric utilities to pay into a fund, or the oil and gas industry to pay into a fund to address what's happening within their communities. And it's all tied into the governance aspect of it. If we don't address what's happening now environmentally and socially, then we're not doing our part as a community. And so it's looking at, the government and the private organizations or public organizations to say, okay, we have these issues that we are experiencing. If you're going to set up shop in this community, what are you doing as an organization to address the environmental and social issues that are impacting the community in which you're operating out of? And so my policy recommendation at the end was, we need to pay into this fund. We need to develop a fund either locally at the local government level or at the state level, and really focus in on addressing these issues, because communities no longer have the time. Look at Isle de Jean Charles. They've been told, we are not putting any more money into your community. Those of you that have remained, you can remain and deal with what's happening to your island, or we have this land that we are willing to relocate you to. If we continue acting as if this is not something that needs to be addressed, South Florida is potentially the next community where they're going to look at us and go, okay, well, everything east of I-95, what is your plan? Time for you to relocate. Or even communities near the Everglades, what is your plan? It's time for you to relocate.
Well, I really appreciate having you discuss this, because even though we initially set out to do an episode about the G for companies, ESG, I think this is it's a sobering discussion that directly from the communities that are experiencing this. And, folks on the pod know I'm a Houstonian. South Florida, a lot of us are already seeing that, it is happening right now, and what can we do to mitigate the risk now and into the future. So I really appreciate you starting with this, Monique, and taking us a little bit through the dissertation and the research you've done. But let's switch gears to the promised topic here. I got a question recently at a workshop I was doing for a client, which was, how do the E, S, and G relate? Right? And this is something you and I have talked about at length, that the G is foundational. Governance is foundational to all of this. So let's start there. You're a governance professional, even though you have E and S expertise. Your day job, you're really doing a lot of governance related work. So let's start, Monique, by talking a little bit about the link between compliance and governance.
Yeah, so governance and compliance are linked, and you need proper oversight over in the governance arena in order to properly address environmental and social issues. And so ESG is a long journey that requires multiple stakeholders within any organization. And this can be a government entity, private organization, whichever model you're looking at, but it requires multiple stakeholders. This doesn't fall under, someone with the compliance title, and it's like, all right, well, you let us know how things are going over on that end, and we sign off on the disclosure at the end of the year and go, yay, we all did it, right? It's a genuine component that is interwoven into the day-to-day operations of any organization. And the oversight implementation has to involve everyone from the top down up. And the governance is the policies, it's the compliance, it's going beyond compliance. It's saying, okay, as leadership, what are the policies that we're going to say our company or will establish and enact, and make sure that we are addressing each one of these things. And so when I look at any governance program and the policies needed, I pull in key stakeholders throughout every single part of the process. And so some of the things that I've done is, when our city manager asked for us to green the government and to establish more policies that allowed us to reduce our waste throughout the government, I pulled in naturally in my mind, let me have a conversation with procurement and accounting so that way we can figure out what is it that they're purchasing so we can reduce what's coming into the city. And then let me establish more refined, more encompassing recycling programs. So the things that we do get that we've already reduced what could potentially be waste, but then what we do generate as waste, can we recycle that? Implementing programs like that.
Was this at City of Tallahassee, just to clarify?
Yes.
You said at the city? Okay, at
yes.
City of Tallahassee, Florida.
City of Tallahassee, yes.
Okay.
And we were able to establish a program where, we were able within City Hall increase our recycling rate, but also decrease what was coming in that would be considered as waste. Looking at every stream of items coming in from paper to electronics, right? Another thing that organizations should also look at is in the environmental area, greenhouse gas emissions, and how does greenhouse gas directly impact that organization versus the operations to what is purchased for operations.
The difference between the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions
exactly,
of greenhouse gases.
Greenhouse gases. And, depending on the organization, that internal stakeholder will differ, right? For the City of Tallahassee, we owned our own electric utility. So for the electric utility, we needed to make sure that what we were emitting, we reduced. What were the, field types, processes that we could do to reduce our emissions? But when you're looking at it from another side of the organization and you're saying, okay, City Hall, we're purchasing, yes, from our own utility, but what does that look like for us to reduce the amount that we need to purchase from our own utility? And, organizations have to look at, okay, how do we operate and how can we reduce? Is it through a scope 1 lens or through a scope 2 lens? And then establishing the policies that oversee that. I couldn't have done a lot of what I do without that support from leadership. And, when I worked in government, it's from the commissioners and the mayor and city manager's office, right? But person that's now worked in nonprofit arena for several years, it's working with our leadership staff, our board, to ensure that we're establishing policies that look at these things holistically and look at how all of our policies intertwine and impact each other. So that way we are meeting targets that we're setting, but identifying where are we now, what's our baseline, and where can we go, and can we push that envelope just a little bit more to even go beyond our comfort level, and setting those targets in the future, but then having that rooted in policy, so that way we can make sure that everyone understands what the role is, what the issues are, where we're going, but also doing the training so that way they understand, like, this is how we are navigating through the world now.
This is a perfect example, and the way you're explaining it is makes so much sense to me, because it's all about, in any organization, whether it's city government, a nonprofit, or a private company or financial institution, right? Whatever entity you're talking about, activities in companies are governed, or should in theory be governed, by policies and procedures. And not that every single thing in the weeds needs to be, but at a high level, right? The policies and procedures that everyone agrees on as priorities are, it's a way to prioritize, and it's a way to make sure that everyone's heading in the same direction. So I love this example, right? And how at the beginning you mentioned, bringing in procurement and accounting that oversees the contracts that of what's already purchased, right? And that multi-stakeholder approach across the organization to kind of get everyone on the same page. And then either that's driven by a policy, or if it's not driven by a policy yet, you're putting in a policy at the end of that discovery period to make sure that everyone is kind of rowing the boat in the same direction.
Definitely. And it even ties to a lot of the social issues. I sit in meetings where we are discussing, we want to establish A. And so let's invite these individuals to the table. And I'm the person that looks at the invited list and they go, I don't see women. I don't see individuals of color. As a woman of color, I'm looking for others other than me to join as part of the discussion, because we're not monolithic, right? And so you need to have different individuals at the table discussing these policy issues and addressing the policy issues, because I may have experienced it one way, but I'm looking at it from a view lens that may be different than someone that, another woman of color, or just another female or a male of color experienced growing up, in West Palm Beach. Our viewpoints, our experiences are different. We're not monolithic. And so having multiple individuals seated at the table, looking at what we're trying to accomplish, identifying what is feasible in a policy recommendation, and really going through and having fruitful discussions, so that way when we roll out something, individuals are not looking at it and going, no, this does not address half of what we need to. You want to aim to do as much as you can and represent as many people as you can, knowing that you're never going to get to 100%, but can we get to 70, 80% and really meeting the needs of the community as a whole?
Mm-hmm. I think we could draw a parallel to corporate governance, and that's one of the reasons there's such a big push for diversity right now on boards, and boards especially, but also at management levels, because it captures the wide variety of human experience, and it's rare that the company who's not impacting all people. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And especially when you are a company, here in South Florida, we're a melting pot of a lot of cultures, right? But when you look at any organization within South Florida and you only see a certain demographic there, then it's not representation of the community in which you are running your organization in. And so then how true is it that you are on the pulse of what your organization can be doing? Because if you're not if you're in a community, or you're operating an office within a community, that office should be reflective, and those that are sitting on the board and in leadership meetings should represent the community in which you're operating out of, right? Women make up about 50% of the planet, and we need to be represented.
Yeah, well, and what's so funny, it just made me think of this, is that for a very long time now, when we're talking about multinational corporations operating abroad in developing countries, there's a concept called local content, which means making sure that, a healthy percentage of your hires are local, your management hires are local, that are folks that you're training up to be part of that company. So you're not just, flying in expats to run something in Equatorial Guinea or wherever. But we don't always think about that here in our own backyard, right? Well, yeah, it's the same thing, right? You want to make sure,
Exactly.
yeah, that you have folks that understand the operating environment are the folks that live in the community, right?
That
And it's just,
understood the
yeah.
the traffic of South Florida and the woes of traveling on I-95.
If nothing else, then for that.
Worth that
um,
alone.
yeah. Well, let's switch gears to career because I know a lot of our listeners are interested in pursuing careers in ES and G. They are interested in the different types of professional education that could help them in this path. And you have a very unique, really a unique career as a compliance professional, but also, with an environmental professional. So there's a couple of qualifications I thought we might mention and just talk briefly about. One is your Certified Compliance and Ethics Professional certificate, and then your, or credential, I guess. And the second is the Certified Environmental and Safety Compliance Officer with the National Registry of Environmental Professionals. And we'll include the links to that in the resource boost for the episode. But if you could talk a little bit about those, I know those have been important to you. And, obviously you're extremely well educated. You're a PhD from Northeastern and your MBA and everything, but those had come up as useful credentials for you. Could you speak a little bit to that?
When I was overseeing a lot more of the environmental area within my career, I sought and obtained certification as a certified environmental safety compliance officer. And that just allowed me to showcase that not only am I working in this arena, but I've, provided the necessary skill sets to indicate that I can look at things holistically in the environmental and safety arena, in environmental health and safety within any organization, and making sure that not only do I understand the policies that are required to run an environmental health and safety program, but I understand what the components are to operate an environmental health and safety program. Later on, after my doctorate at Northeastern, I stumbled across the Compliance and Ethics Board for Certified Compliance and Ethics Professionals, and that actually is not easy exam to sit for because you have to also showcase that you've been working in compliance for X amount of years. You have to undergo several classes even before you are able to sit for that exam. But I'm grateful that I did do it because right now in ESG, there's been a lot of conversation about where should ESG fall under. And there's a lot of discussion that, well, since compliance professionals already are used to working across the board with different stakeholders, they're used to testing and measuring and making policy recommendations, ESG should fall under compliance, right? And so me having this certification, I'm able to look at it really with the lens of governance holistically. Yes, I have a strong environmental and social background, but with that professional certification, I'm able to go, okay, how is this going to impact the board? How do I communicate this to our board? How do I communicate this on a regular basis to everyone else in the leadership team, and be able to showcase where we are, what I'm monitoring, and how I'm mitigating those risks and monitoring those risks on a regular basis, and then be able to publish an annual report to our leadership and to our board and to, any external stakeholder. And so those certifications help to say, like, okay, not only is she doing it, but there's a lot of training and ongoing training that shows that I'm able to implement all of this on a regular basis because I sit through a lot of CEUs annually to maintain my professional certification, because I truly believe that they help with even bringing topics to the table where I go, oh, I see that in the lens and where I'm working right now, and let me apply it. So they're great certifications to obtain as you continue going through the trajectory.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Monique. And I think it's always really helpful. I mean, we see there's programs everywhere for everything, right? But which ones are really helpful for your career where you truly get something out of it? And I think it sounds like these have been really, really great for you, especially the Certified Compliance and Ethics credential. And just to clarify, CEUs, the continuing education units, I guess, is that's
Yes.
the continuing education program? Okay. So like an attorney, really, or an accounting professional, you're
Exactly.
actually, yeah, you're actually staying on top of all of those
And most of
changes.
the CEUs I sit through on a regular basis, I'm sitting in a room with accountants and attorneys on a regular basis because, especially with the compliance and ethics professional, because we're so entwined with those other areas within our field, we're usually sitting in the same room with them, going through the CEUs together to obtain the same information, but my lens is going to be different than their lens and the application of it all.
That's so interesting. And I mean, this is something that, a lot of companies are trying to figure out, right? Where do we put ESG in the organization? Well, ESG is three different huge buckets of topics, right? So it's not, your lawyers and your accountants are already doing a lot of governance work. Your compliance professionals are doing a lot of governance work. It's not like a single title you can
Nope.
you can give someone. I say that as someone with a ESG in my title, but so I'm
Which is
sort of,
why I said at the
oh
beginning, it is
man.
interlaced
Oh
among
yeah.
everyone.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I was just going to say too, it's interesting that the compliance seat is, you're suggesting that that's a really natural place to put a lot of E&S and G items, because I have been hearing, of course, from attorneys, from clients across the board, right? As these particular topics, specific material E&S topics for companies become more, I guess the scrutiny is growing in terms of the disclosures and making sure the disclosures are up to snuff, that they're closer to a standard, which I know there's a lot of work happening on that in
Yes.
the world of what that standard might be. The latest SEC rule announcement about climate related disclosures. And I think a growing interest and a need internally in organizations to prioritize looking at, oh, well, we're talking about this particular topic in our sustainability report. We're making claims about it. We're making future looking statements about it. What policies do we have in place behind this? And where is it written down? And who's actually in charge? And I mean, most sophisticated companies are gonna have that for the major issues, but I think it's worth looking at from an audit, from a compliance perspective. Which of these topics in our sustainability report are we really kind of talking a lot about? Which ones are potentially material to our stock price? If we don't yet have a policy in place for something that's perhaps outside of the realm of the traditional governance and compliance, I guess, requirements, then we need to think about getting serious about having something in place. So anyways, it's very interesting that you're pointing out that the compliance and risk professionals are those seats within an organization might be a really great place to have those responsibilities lie.
And I know that it's a lot of work already. And I've heard the discussion from both sides, right? For compliance professionals, that this is one more thing that we're going to have to take ownership of. We're already dealing with data privacy regulations, GDPR for those of us that, work in industries that do business within the European Union. And, there's all of these different things that as a compliance professional, we're in charge of, and getting information for throughout the organization. But for me, because I have the environmental and social background, I'm like, sign me up. Yes. Like, I understand this world because that's everything that I've been doing for over 15 years is the environmental and social aspect and looking at what policies impact when we roll out a policy, how does it impact our people? How does it impact our communities that we're serving? Or, what is the waste stream? What are our emissions? What policies are we implementing so we can reduce our water intake, and discharge? And so for me, it makes sense, but I understand both sides of the discussion of like, this is another thing that we have to oversee. But I also think it makes sense because we're already monitoring, mitigating risks, identifying, writing policies, and showing those impacts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just wanted, you mentioned GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. That's the EU data protection privacy laws. Yeah. I just like to make sure I spell out or catch the acronyms on the podcast. So hopefully I didn't miss any today. Monique, this has just been so great to chat with you. And like I said, you're the very rare professional that truly has expertise in environmental, social, and governance. So I'm so grateful to have had you on today. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? Just any other final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I just want to say thank you for having me on today. Any one of these topics, I will go into a deep dive in. Let's have a policy discussion to figure out how we can save the world. So thank you for keeping me on task today. I really appreciate it. I was like, let me know if you want to talk about environmental equity next. It's one of my favorite topics.
I think that's its own. It's a whole other episode.
For sure. We could do a deep dive on that another moment. But no, I appreciate you having me on today.
Well, it's just been a pleasure having you on. I'm so grateful we were finally able to achieve this. And for listeners, we will include all the resources mentioned in our resource boost to this episode. And as always, we love to hear from you. Please let us know what you thought of the episode, and feel free to get in touch via social media with any other topics that you'd like to hear more about. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to ESG Decoded. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours, and follow ESG Decoded and ClimeCo across social media platforms. Until our next episode, take what you learned today to drive long-term value for your organization by doing good for people and the planet.